Welcome to the DYK podcast. My name is Richard Ford and I'm your host. We are pleased and honored to launch our podcast discussion series with Dr. Richard Southall from the University of South Carolina. Dr. Southall is the director of the College Sports Research Institute in Columbia. He has written and spoken on college sports issues for decades, exploring the intersection of college sports amateurism-based values and the business of college sports. Dr. Southall's work includes analyzing NCAA graduation and academic progress measurements, the racialization of the big-time college sports business model and the exploitation of profit athletes in Power 5 football and men's basketball, an explanation of former NCAA President Myles Brand's development of the Collegiate Model to justify conducting professional sports under the banner of higher education, and the labor rights of athletes. Dr. Southall has lectured around the world on college sports issues and has also testified before Congress. In May of 2023, Dr. Southall, along with four co-authors, published a new book titled The NCAA and the Exploitation of College Profit Athletes, an Amateurism That Never Was. The book offers a comprehensive synthesis of the history, values, stakeholder motivations, and recurring exploitation and labor issues in college sports. It is a must-read. Our visit with Dr. Southall is framed through his seminal 2013 article, which he co-authored with Dr. Ellen Starowski of Ithaca College, titled Cheering on the Collegiate Model, Creating, Disseminating, and Embedding the NCAA's Redefinition of Amateurism. Brand's Collegiate Model is a Rosetta Stone to understanding the college sports business model and the justifications for it. In his 2006 State of the Association speech at the NCAA Centennial Convention, Brand captured the absurdity and hypocrisy of the college sports business model in 7 words. Amateur defines the participant, not the enterprise. Join us for a wide-ranging discussion of this important concept. And just a note, this interview was conducted on February 6th of 2023. Enjoy. Professor Southall, welcome to the DYK Media podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I just have to say up front, it's really an honor and a privilege to have you as our inaugural interview guest. And I have been a huge fan of your work for years. And I guess I reached out to you maybe a year ago and we've had some great conversations. And when we talk, I'm taking notes and my thoughts are bouncing around. And I just love the way that you have approached your scholarship on college sports. And I have come to believe that understanding Myles Brand's collegiate model is really the Rosetta Stone to understanding the business model and the relationship between the business model and the values of higher education. And you have written beautifully on that. And in particular, a 2013 article titled Cheering on the Collegiate Model, Creating, Disseminating, and Embedding the NCAA's Redefinition of Amateurism. I think every university president, athletics director, trustee should read that article. And I would like for you to just talk about the importance of that model in the business of college sports.
Well, first I need to mention that Dr. Ellen Starowski is co-author on that article with me. And through the years, her work has informed a great deal of work that I've done all the way going back to College Athletes for Hire, which was literally the book that set me on my course back in 1997 to looking at college athletics. And when I first started looking at college sport writ large, what I found interesting was the convoluted nature of college sport and how you had to go through some axioms or things that you had to accept as true regardless of anything else in order to move forward. What I found fascinating when I started reading Myles Brand's work and started reading his State of the Association addresses, which we can get into a whole discussion of how the use of the term State of the Association, harkens to State of the Union.
Mm-hmm.
The NFL does that same thing to try to give college sport this gravitas and to give it this timeless nature. And so what I found when I started looking at Myles Brand's work was that his work was that of a philosopher, number one, and number two, a philosopher of language. So he knew full well what he was doing when he made such statements as amateur defines the participant, not the enterprise. And so for him to start, and that's to me the most important quote in all of his work, is when he differentiates labor from the industry. And if you go back and read some things in the history of labor, the labor movement in the United States, it's very common that the owners or the capitalists referred to their industry differently than they referred to their laborers. And so that to me was the most important thing when I started looking at Brand's work.
Let me say apologies to Professor Strowski. I didn't mean to exclude her. And I love her work. In fact, the book you mentioned, College Athletes for Hire, is on my short list of books that I think anybody who's serious about understanding what's happening in college sports or what has happened, that's at the top of the list. And she's been very influential as well. I did not mean to exclude her. But when you were talking about Brand, you talked about this process of elevating the NCAA president to this kind of special status. And in your article, the 2013 article, you referred to Brand as the philosopher king. And Brand was the first former university president who became the NCAA president. Before that, we had Walter Byers was a journalist, I think, came up from a journalism background. Then we had some athletic director types. But Brand was a new type of president. Could you explain the significance of that and his role as the philosopher king?
Well, part of what he knew, I think he and Wally Renfro came to understand, was that if you control the language of the discussion, you control the discussion. And so when they came up and said and decided that the collegiate model needed to be a better understood definition or redefinition of amateurism that isolates the way in which we view this amateur, quote unquote, amateur industry to one in which the goals of higher education are in tune with it. What they don't really talk about is the fact that academic capitalism has come to be the viewpoint of the university. The universities much more see their students as consumers and them providing a product. I think it's telling in this past year's State of the Association or State of College Sport address, Linda Livingstone talked about and Mark Emmert reiterated that the actual goal of higher education is graduation. And having graduation be the goal is fundamentally different than the goal being educating.
Right.
And getting, students to have a grasp of the world at large. Graduation is easily done if you just have requisite number of credit hours and then you give a diploma, which is fundamentally different. You go all the way back to the Wizard of Oz. If you ever watch the end of that show, where the scarecrow is given a diploma, and then he says what we think is the Pythagorean theorem, but it's a mistaken formulation of the Pythagorean theorem. So he said, "Oh, joy, rapture, I've got a brain." Well, all he received was a diploma. He didn't receive an education. And so I think that's interesting in and of itself. But I think Brand understood that that's what higher education was evolving into, was a product which had a collegiate experience, which the collegiate model of athletics is part of the collegiate experience for both athletes and students and alumni and just the regular college sport fan. So fundamentally, the president has a sense of gravitas. And so it's easier for folks to believe, in quotation marks, what a college president says college sport is about, because you gain spontaneous consent, you gain hegemony through the deference that's given to college presidents as the gatekeepers of higher education.
Yeah, I'm laughing to myself because I have like 10 questions from what you just said. I mean, you raised so many important points. I'll try to organize them in my mind as I ask the first one. And that is, You mentioned Linda Livingstone's speech. She's the chair of the new NCAA Board of Governors post-constitutional makeover. And normally, the chair of the NCAA Board of Governors wouldn't be speaking. This was a unique State of the Association because we have a transition from Emmert to Baker. It was, Emmert's swan song. But it's really interesting that you talked about how they described education, and you have observed in some of your work about how the media talks about athletes and education, that we're not even speaking that language anymore. During broadcasts, for example, you don't hear the talking heads speaking of the academic achievements of the athletes. We never hear who makes academic All-American or makes the conference, Power Five conference academic honor roll. That's just been removed from the language. So that language has changed. And you have done some really important work on graduation rates. That's the other thing that popped into my mind as you were talking about this transition, away from the value of the educational process and to the degree, graduation. Could you talk a little bit about your work with the graduation measurements that the NCAA has used and the significance of that in this collegiate model and the propagandization of the relationship between higher education and the business interest?
Well, let's start with the first point that I always tell my students. The name of the NCAA graduation rate metric is the graduation success rate. So they put right in the title that this metric is going to be successful, and the NCAA and college sport writ large is going to be successful at graduating college athletes. Well, what happened was in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the NCAA was doing some research on graduation rates. And what they found was that if you removed athletes who transferred, which is interesting in light of the whole transfer portal concept now, or left in good academic standing, you'd remove about a third of the eligible athletes from the cohort. And so if you remove athletes that transfer and remove athletes that leave in good academic standing, what you're left with is a disproportionate higher rate of graduation. So by those two things, when they saw that they would receive a graduation rate or would come to a graduation rate that was 15 to 25% higher than the federal graduation rate, which is what the federal government had mandated as a graduation rate metric, coming on the heels of Kevin Ross and Dexter Manley testifying for Congress in the 1980s, when we had abysmal graduation rates. And so the NCAA developed this metric that they knew was going to drive up graduation rates. They then started using that as a talking point about athletes graduating at rates that are higher than the general population. Well, there is no graduation success rate for full-time students, for regular students. There isn't. So to compare the graduation success rate for athletes with the federal graduation rate, specifically or not, when those numbers are put onto a report next to each other, even though they're not the same numbers, any person, layperson is going to mix those two statistical analyses, and that's what's happened. And so also the NCAA and member universities have learned how to, it's kind of like being a capologist in the NFL. You learn how to deal within the system. And so the NCAA members, those universities, athletic departments, have learned how to make sure you get a higher graduation rate. If a player is going to leave or transfer or leave in good academic standing, as long as they meet those standards, they're removed from the cohort, they become basically irrelevant to your metric. Right. And so that was developed in 2003 as part of this, in conjunction with this collegiate model. So it's all of the use of language, and we're graduating athletes. That's the quid pro quo. They don't need to be paid because they're getting a priceless education. We know they're getting a priceless education because we have higher and higher and higher graduation rates. So then it's all used as a response to critics who might say, well, why are these athletes not being paid? Because they have low graduation rates. Well, the rejoinder is, well, they don't have low graduation rate. Our graduation rate metric shows that they're graduating at 90%. Well,
right.
It's sort of like back in the day, John Calipari, when he was, at the University of Memphis, said that he graduated 80% of his seniors. Well, yeah, if you make it up to your senior year, what's the next year? You graduate. So he graduated 50% of his players during his time at Memphis. That doesn't sound as good as saying I graduated 80% of my seniors. So the NCAA, through the graduation success rate, changed the dialogue on graduation rates from one in which they were getting hammered because of their federal graduation rates to one in which they controlled the dialogue and they were being successful using their graduation rate. So they knew full well what would happen. So then you build a narrative from there.
You tied that made-up metric into what Myles Brand was doing with the Collegiate Model in 2003, and that's so important. Could you talk a little bit about going back to the framework of cheering on the Collegiate Model, the discussion of the tactics of you called it the hegemon. A lot of people may not know what that is. If you could kind of explain what that is. And then this process of spontaneous consent to that monolithic authority figure, and the consequence of that in the evolution of Brand's Collegiate Model into his 2006 State of the Association speech.
Well, what's fascinating is Myles Brand knew history, and he knew history of college sport. So Walter Byers was the first person to get this spontaneous consent through his use of the term student athlete, a term which in all the litigation that has gone on, if you go back and look at the decisions as written, so many of them have the term used within the actual case, the actual decision, which tells you then right away that the judge in that case, he or she didn't want to change college sport as we know it. So they nibble around the edges and then we're going to make reform as opposed to, blowing the system up. So what happens with this spontaneous consent and you have, whether it's college presidents or members of athletic conferences, the conference commissioners or the president of the NCAA, they somehow, when they go before Congress or when they're talking in the media, there's great deference given to these individuals on their view of college sport. And Myles Brand understood very well that if you say that the collegiate model is 100 years old or it's whatever, that it has stood the test of time. And he talks about it tying communities together, generations together. So all of this, it harkens back to, Knute Rockne, All-American, and Ronald Reagan as the Gipper, and all of this lengthy discussion. And hegemony is when people think, well, this is the way it's always been, and it's been good up to this point, and everybody loves it. So why would we want to harm it by going in a radical direction? And that's most often how hegemony is used, is to deflect from any alternate view of the universe or alternate view of reality. And so if the hegemon can get the general public to buy into its perspective on things, then it's going to be much more effective. What's fascinating, I ask this question of my students. I ask them, why is it that college athletes have to go to school full-time? Any number of people go to school part-time for some period of time or another. Instead of working a full-time job and going to school full-time, they may work a full-time job and go to school part-time. Well, profit athletes, football players, Power 5, men's basketball players, Power 5, women's basketball players, Power 5, they're working fundamentally a full-time job. So why is it that we say they have to be full-time students? And I said, who said this? Where did it come from? Why does that make any more sense? Why can't they go to school part-time and finish out going to school later on when they're no longer an athlete and they've gotten cut from their third NFL team and they want to go back to school full-time? Why can't we do some sort of arrangement as a benefit and do it that way? And students have a really difficult time questioning something that has just been accepted because it's been accepted. And so that to me illustrates a spontaneous consent on why things are done the way that they're being done now.
And in cheering on the 2013 article, you use sources and authorities that are really built around understanding propaganda. And when you use the term propaganda now, a lot of people reflexively think that's a bad thing to say, but in its purest form, that's really a tool of the hegemon, isn't it?
You
To
bet.
to reinforce the value system. And with amateurism, the collegiate model, the student athlete, those tactics of the hegemon have acquired a secondary cultural meaning, and they're so deeply embedded in the way that we think about college sports, it's almost impossible to extract, isn't it?
Right. Well, one of the examples that I sometimes use as an analogy is NFL films.
Hmm.
If you follow the history of the NFL, when Steve Sabol and the Sabol family began producing NFL films and the frozen tundra of Lambeau Field and all of that stuff, that was a really important milestone in the growth of the NFL as a cultural piece. Well, the same thing is done in college sport. We have famous families in college sport, whether it's this family or that family. The Manning family is the one right now that is the first family of college football in many ways, and moving into being the first family of NFL football and all of those sorts of things. So you have this use of mythology and this use of imagery and use of language and music and vivid images that are used to cement our view of college sport. And you can go generation by generation, because I ask my students in the college sport class that I teach, how many of them have a vivid memory as a small child of going to a college football game? Almost every single one of them raised their hand. And who did you go with? You went with your father or your mother or your brother. And so that's how your generational passage of time is marked by those events. And did you watch football games or men's basketball games with your family? Did you go to a Final Four game? And do you know the mythology? And we have the numbers of the players in the stadium that people can remember back. So all of this imagery is part of what develops into the collegiate model.
Right.
And so it's much more than amateurism. It's a cultural iconography, or whatever the term is, that's really what Myles Brand was talking about.
Right. And I want to talk about the importance of that. When you first started talking about the collegiate model, you said that Brand knew exactly what he was doing. And we're going to try to transition into another important era, the 2013, 2014 era, where the NCAA and the Power Five started hiring experts to promote their propaganda. But that dynamic that you just described is so powerful that we see it in judicial decisions. We see it among decision makers in higher education. So you have these environments where you have extraordinarily smart people in jobs that require them to look critically and dispassionately at evidence, yet the power of that mythology seeps its way into those two cultures and has really resulted in an environment, at least up until 2021, where the NCAA has really had a free pass under the law, and there really hasn't been a lot of pushback at the institutional level.
Well, college presidents, the president's box at a football stadium is front and center to the power structure of that stadium. To be in the president's box, who's in that box? Members of Congress, members of the judiciary, and so on and so forth, the movers and shakers. That's where the business of college sport is being done, subtly or otherwise. Luxury suites, luxury boxes are sold to major stakeholders in college sport. So right. The big business of college sport is taking place at the quote unquote front porch of the university, but those donors, those people, those stakeholders are important not only to the athletic department, but they're also major movers and shakers in the university setting as well. And inextricably, those board of trustees, they enjoy the football games as well. They enjoy the basketball games as well. And you view those 85,000, those 100,000 people that are in that stadium, that's a powerful dynamic.
Yes, indeed.
To if you're there and the chant, or whatever the chant is, whatever the music is, whatever the script that goes on in that stadium, it's powerful for those people at that university, and everybody respects everybody else's traditions. And so it really is like going to a mass. If you're a Catholic, you can go anywhere in the world and the mass is going to be the same. Well, the same thing in college sport. Every cathedral on Power 5 campuses, and even on smaller campuses, that football stadium, in many ways, the basketball arena are the temple, so to speak, of college sport.
Yeah, you know that I played basketball at Duke, and Cameron Indoor is like that. And I went back to Coach K's last game last March in Cameron. And, I of all people should be able to rise above the emotion. But man, I just got sucked right in. It's overwhelming. It's so powerful. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was an incredible experience. But when you're in it, you can't think clearly. It's not a rational way of seeing the world. And I want to talk about that a little bit in the judicial context. And you had a front row seat to the O'Bannon litigation, and you have written about that. And Claudia Wilken, who was a district court judge in that case in the Northern District of California, she also heard the Austin case. And she was very progressive by judicial standards in terms of at least saying that the NCAA was held to the same standard as any other market actor under the Sherman Act. And that was, plowing new territory there because of all this deference that had been built in to the judiciary's view of college sports. But in an article, I think this is a 2015 article, right after the Ninth Circuit's decision in O'Bannon, you co-authored a paper with Richard Karcher called Distributive Injustice. And you went through the cases really going back pre-Board of Regents and then through Board of Regents and post-Board of Regents. And you were talking about O'Bannon because it had just come out. And you observed that even in that case that everybody thought was going to be the case that was going to really move athletes' rights forward, Judge Wilken was very deferential to the NCAA's conceptualization of amateurism, and the Ninth Circuit even more so. And how do you think about that now? And do you think that that is a dynamic that still exists? Yeah.
Look, it's amazing because of the cultural importance of college sport. I think judges writ large, or the judiciary, nobody wants to be the one that really blows it up.
Yep.
Because like you're saying, it's so powerful. And in many ways, and Mark Emmert talked about this and had talked about it numerous times, you're only talking about 2%, 3% of college athletes that are being exploited. It's a small number writ large. When you have 500,000 or however many hundreds of thousands of college athletes you have today, most of those college athletes, their market value is much less than what they're receiving. Their grant and aid for them is a really good deal in many ways. And so when you're talking about college sport, and if you don't differentiate the profit athletes, and that's why we use the term profit athletes versus loss athletes. And a profit athlete is an athlete whose market value is greater than the compensation that they're receiving. Whereas a loss athlete is an athlete whose market value is less than the compensation. So for those loss athletes, even a partial grant and aid is more than their market value. And that's played out for the vast majority of athletes in quote unquote name, image, and likeness. They're not making big bucks because they don't have a market value. And so what happens is judges are thinking about this, and their clerks are thinking about this when they're investigating and researching these decisions and the state of college sport. They come to the conclusion, I think, most of them, that for most college athletes, the system as it's set up is fairly equitable. And so they're trying to thread that proverbial needle into making it equitable for that 2%. And that's why now what you're hearing is, well, if we pay the players, and they're not talking about paying all the players, nobody's gone there. But if we pay the profit athletes, then what's going to happen to Title IX What's going to happen to Olympic development? What's going to happen to all these other athletes in Division II and Division III if the system blows up? Well, basically, the article that Professor Karcher and I wrote was saying, okay, if you're going to do a utilitarian argument, as the greatest good for the greatest number, you can make an argument that while we are screwing over, we are exploiting a certain percentage for 98%, it's a good deal. So a utilitarian would say, sorry, we just have to sacrifice the 2% for the 98%. And you're hearing that over and over and over again. That's the language that's being used to justify the current system in which we cannot pay the players. Because if we pay the players, then what's going to happen to these other? New York Times Magazine 2 weeks ago had an article that was the exact article. Now, the problem that people don't really want to talk about is that's a clearly a racialized situation. Because let's say, for example, 82 to 85% of all starters in the SEC are Black in football, and as high of a percentage in men's basketball. So basically what you're saying is those two sports, which are highly and disproportionately African-American, are going to be used to subsidize all the other sports, which disproportionately are white and upper class. And that's the beneath the surface, dirty little secret that nobody really wants to talk about, is how racialized this system is.
Right. And in the congressional campaign that the NCAA and the Power Five launched in 2019, they've used that wedge, that's really a product, as I see it, of Myles Brand's collegiate model as a financial model. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But you mentioned that New York Times Magazine article. It was titled Student, period, Athlete, period, Mogul, period. And the cover picture was Armando Bacot stepping out of a Carolina blue Audi, I believe it was.
Which is identified as an $80,000 car.
Correct. And through that article, all of these narratives, many versus few, the us versus them, was just reinforced by people who were white stakeholders like, Bubba Cunningham and Mac Brown, who got paid bonuses, or actually Cunningham got paid bonuses during last year's Final Four when Armando Bacot, on a nearly broken ankle, limped Carolina to the national championship game. And I read that. I was furious, honestly, Professor Southall, when I finished that article. I just thought that this is a perfect example. And this is from the New York Times Magazine, a progressive news outlet. And the narratives that were built into that article were racialized, I think, and they play right into the NCAA and Power Five's campaign in Congress right now, which is that if we do anything to recognize the value and the interests of the profit athletes, then the sky's going to fall and we're going to start cutting sports, all that stuff. But I want to tie that back to Myles Brand's collegiate model, and that was his 2006 State of the Association speech. And he identified 3 principles of the collegiate model. He was defining it. And the third one, he was talking about that intercollegiate athletics is embedded in the values of higher education. But then as he was explaining that third principle, he talked about the financial framework of the collegiate model that supports that premise. Could you talk a little bit about that?
We must do the business of college sport, and we must do it well. So we have to make as much money and generate as much revenue on the input side to meet our obligation on the output side, which is a charitable educational enterprise. So what he's basically saying, that if we don't make as much money as possible, if we don't exploit every opportunity in the sports, Power 5 football, Power 5 men's basketball writ large, and we don't do the business of college sport. And so what he's basically justifying is exploitation, because as much as we need to do the business of college sport well, one of the business aspects is making sure we don't compensate the labor too much. Right. Because if we compensate the labor equitably, then that's going to reduce the amount of revenue that we can put into the output side, which gives opportunities for other college athletes, who have little, if any, market value. So
Right.
basically what he didn't come out and say it, but if you read what he's saying, is one of the principles has to be generating as much money as possible and keeping our costs as low as possible as well. So in many ways, it's a justification of exploitation that's couched in this benevolent fashion of just redistributing the revenue to those sports that can't afford to support themselves.
Yeah, and the way he characterized that, he said that institutions had a mandate. It was a moral imperative
That's
to
right.
maximize revenue in football, and I think he was more concerned about men's basketball because as a result of Board of Regents, the NCAA
And
sole
talking
source.
about it as the NCAA, because that's the
Right.
NCAA Association's generation of revenue is from the men's basketball tournament.
So on the input side, as I interpret that explanation, it's like we can have the NBA and the NFL and football and men's basketball. That's okay so long as on the output side, we're sending that money downstream in a way that we can say is consistent with our nonprofit mission. And that he expressed that through participation opportunities. And
That's right, which is consistent with the NCAA tagline of 400,000, 460,000, 500,000 who go pro in something other than sports. So those few that do go professional in sport, we need to generate as much revenue off of their talent so we can give it to the other athletes who are not going pro, but are turning out to be good citizens and, the alumni and all of those sorts of things.
Right. So I want to transition now to this period of 2013-14. Let me ask you this. When you look at the reason that Myles Brand formulated the collegiate model, how do you see that? I mean, was he under external pressure? What was it? What was the flashpoint for him to come up with this grand rationalization?
Well, I think both he and Wally Renfro must have had long conversations in which clearly the general public was not viewing college sport in the same lens of amateurism as we normally see. Because if you have, for example, around the same time period, I was giving some lectures down in Brazil for a colleague at a university there. And when we would talk about the fact that college football players in the big Power 5 schools were not getting paid salaries, the people in Brazil were like, well, how can that be? They're clearly professionalized. The stadiums are 85, 90, 100,000. They thought the college athlete was getting paid just like players in the Premier League or in their soccer leagues and so on and so forth. So what Brand and Renfro, I think, had to do was come up with some rationale for that optic that was clearly professionalized and commercialized college sport. And the reason for that was the participants had to be amateurs, but there was nothing wrong. There was actually a mandate, like you mentioned before, for it to be as professionalized and commercialized as possible. And so Myles knew, I think, what they were doing very clearly. So they had to come up with some way. What's the compensation that is used or given to these athletes? Well, and you'd hear things around this time period that education was priceless, which tied in with, at the time, there was a MasterCard, a very successful commercial that talked about experiences that you pay with a credit card. You're buying priceless experiences. And they used the same terminology that education, who can put a price on education? And so this use of the language to justify the professionalization of the enterprise from the labor. So it's a labor management dichotomy that they knew what they were doing.
Right. And then, of course, Myles Brand passed away in 2009. He had cancer. And then we transitioned into Mark Emmert. And we start to see the mounting external forces outside of college sports, because up until then, the NCAA really had a monopoly, not just over the value system, but of the regulation of college sports. And then you started to have external regulatory threats come in through these antitrust suits. You had White that was actually filed in 2006. So that same year, and that was a cost of attendance suit. It was a class action antitrust suit. And then you had in 2005, you had the House Ways and Means Committee questioning whether the football and basketball products were consistent with NCAA's nonprofit mission because they're an education nonprofit. So you had some of those external pressures. They started to ramp up into O'Bannon and then into Austin. And then in this 2013-14 period, some really important things happened. I would like for you to talk a little bit about this because you went and you testified in the Senate Commerce Committee in 2014 when the NCAA, and actually this was the Power Five, but the NCAA was kind of the front face of the Power Five's interest to try to get autonomy legislation. If you could talk a little bit about that process and that hearing and the importance of that time frame.
Well, what was fascinating at this time period was the NCAA was being called on the carpet, so to speak, for a number of different things, but was always retreating back to that we're an educational association. And so my discussion was, okay, this is how their graduation rate metrics are part of that discussion. And what really the NCAA had to do was to give the Power Five conferences autonomy. And Division II and Division III and smaller schools in Division I that were not part of the Power Five structure, they knew that they had to give the NCAA the ability to increase compensation to forestall players going on strike or doing something drastic. So what happened at this time period is you had cost of attendance stipends that came into place. And that was one of the most important things because effectively what it was a pay raise for the players without being identified as a pay raise. Again, I go back and I tell my students, what is a stipend? Well, if you look in the dictionary, a stipend is a salary, and it's compensation or it's pay, but we don't think of a stipend in the same way we think of a negotiated salary. Right. Stipends are oftentimes used in educational settings for grad students and that kind of thing. So the NCAA membership and the Power Five conferences specifically, they knew that they had to get an opportunity to compensate the athletes to forestall this discussion about paying college athletes by paying college athletes, but not paying everybody because Division III and Division II didn't want to go down this path. So basically what they had to be granted by the NCAA membership overall was autonomy status. The NCAA doesn't call them Power Five conferences, they call them autonomy conferences. Right. And so the autonomy conferences, the Power Five conferences, basically come up with a new compensation structure that allows them to pay college athletes, but don't call it pay, which is another whole use of language. Anytime that the form of compensation is approved by the NCAA membership, it's no longer defined as pay. Pay is any compensation that is not approved. So the cost of attendance stipend is still not pay for play.
You raise a really important point I wanted to ask you about. They fold that cost of attendance. Initially, it was called a stipend. And I'll say this, Myles Brand in 2006 did a speech before the National Press Club, and he got a question in the Q&A because there was discussion then, because, the white suit was a cost of attendance suit. Right. And the question was, do you think athletes should get stipends? Myles Brand just leaned right in and said, no, hell no. Right. And that stipend would convert these amateurs into professionals.
Right.
Then we fast forward to 2014, you had Claudia Wilkin issuing an order in which the cost of attendance scholarship was a remedy for nil compensation. So it was really initially defined as nil compensation. Then the Power Five, they say, no, we're going to call it something else, and it's part of the athletic scholarship. But this notion of taking pay and putting it into the athletic scholarship and then saying it's okay because this is an educational exchange. Do you think that's an honest way of describing the relationship? And two, do you think the athletic scholarship is outright pay for play?
It's been pay for play since 1956.
Right.
It is what it is. And somehow or another, the NCAA has convinced people through spontaneous consent that somehow getting paid to play is bad.
Right.
It sullies, but Brand then talks about, and Emmert talks about how this notion of amateurism has elements of classism and the difference between upper class and lower class and all of that. So that's another reason they don't call it amateurism. They call it the collegiate model. And this whole notion of compensation somehow sullying you. So if I get paid, that somehow makes me a mercenary or some, this whole notion is just go ahead.
Or a criminal.
That's right.
The NCAA infractions and enforcement process still has that stigma. And I think that's part of the power of the hegemon in labeling a violation of NCAA rules the equivalent of a crime. And athletes are treated as criminals when their names are splashed on the front page and they've violated some Mickey Mouse NCAA rule.
Well, it goes even further back than that. The NCAA calls its bylaws legislation, which gives it the imprimatur of a state actor.
Right.
The NCAA is not a state actor. 1988 Tarkanian case clearly stated that the NCAA is not a state actor, but the NCAA wants to view its bylaws as legislation. And if you violate legislation, it's somehow illegal. And people talk about NCAA scandals as if there's somehow something scandalous. Whereas today, the perp walk that Terrell Pryor and the Ohio State players had to go through today would simply be an NIL exchange.
That's right. That's such a good point.
Nobody really thinks about that.
And I've made the same point about the basketball scandal. Some of these fact patterns where there was a payment, like with NC State. I did some work on that NC State case, and one of the athletes, Dennis Smith Jr., was a phenomenal point guard, one and done kind of point guard. There was an allegation that Adidas, through an intermediary, got $40,000 to an associate of the Smith family. And the federal judge in the Southern District of New York, Lewis Kaplan, issued an opinion where he said that, you have to have a victim. And so the universities were really the victims here.
Right.
He elevated in some ways the violation of NCAA rules to the status of federal criminal law. But that transaction today would not only be entirely legitimate, but most people will be asking, why the hell did you settle for $40,000?
Right. Right.
So coming into this crucial period of 2013, 2014, a couple of other things happened. One was just a few weeks before that hearing that you testified at in Senate Commerce, which was chaired by Jay Rockefeller, a Democrat from West Virginia, who was no fan of Mark Emmert's, I don't think. But the NCAA hired the most prominent lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., Brownstein Hyatt. And then at or about the same time, they hired one of the most influential PR firms in DC, Bully Pulpit Interactive Inc., as part of this makeover to really bring their influence inside the Beltway. And I would like your thoughts on how that
Lead One was coming into existence.
In Lead One, right.
And so they understood the message. And if you something subtle that started taking place at the same time period, they rebranded the basketball court during the March Madness tournament. If you think back to prior to this time period, the NCAA logo was at half court. Big, huge NCAA logo, big NCAA. Well, what happened after this time period became the bracket. The bracket now is on the court, and the NCAA logo goes up here and is much diminished. So everybody loves March Madness. Everybody hates the NCAA. So the NCAA started taking a much less of a proactive approach to things and minimizing their discussion. You started hearing from other actors much more. Lead One's transition from the D1 Athletic Directors Association to Lead One was very important as well, because you have a partly in response to Mark Emmert, who Mark Emmert knew full well that his role was to be the villain. And everything would have been much better, everybody thinks, if Mark Emmert wouldn't have been involved. And he knew this. When I met him backstage or whatever at the Commerce Committee hearings, I joked and said, well, the rest of us are here just to take up space while they shoot all the arrows at you. And he says, yeah, I know. So I think if you change who the members are that you're looking at, everybody loves their universities.
Right.
And that was very clear during that hearing, because no matter what senator came in, he or she made some mention of their flagship university in whatever state it was, and how, everybody gets a great opportunity at their university or that university. And clearly, the NCAA was damaged goods by this time. And you see much more often the conference commissioners rotating almost about who's going to be a spokesperson for what's going on, and then Bill Hancock or whomever else with the college football playoff. So Mark Emmert, I think by this time, he pretty well knew what his role was, and his role was to be the face of the NCAA that had let people down, so to speak.
Yeah. And, a lot of people will be willing to take arrows for $3 million a year. But going back to the hearing, the purpose of the hearing, and this, the autonomy movement, and then this transition to really hiring these high profile, high powered experts, and tying that back into the role of the hegemon. The presidents, the NCAA presidents, have been really the mouthpiece, the propaganda outlet. You had a compliant sports media. I think that's still an issue as well. Like that New York Times magazine article is a good example of that. But you had this transition to Brownstein Hyatt, the lobbying firm, Bully Pulpit, the public relations expert. In terms of the power of the hegemon, do you think that was an inflection point in the way that the NCAA was externalizing its message for public consumption? And do you think that it's been effective?
I think really most people today have made a differentiation in college sport and are very comfortable with the Power Five being off by itself. The college football playoff is no longer viewed as some radical event. That expansion from 4 teams to 12 teams is now going to turn the holidays from Thanksgiving to New Year's in that time period into March Madness,
right,
writ large. And I think by and large, the college sport fan, the fan of big time college football, let's talk about in this case right now, they are perfectly happy with this. There is no discussion, as you mentioned a little bit before, there is no discussion of these athletes missing school, missing classes. There's no discussion of their majors. It just doesn't occur anymore. When we first started studying the description of majors during the men's basketball tournament, there would be 30 mentions in all the broadcasts, and then it dropped to 11. Now you maybe have 1 at most during all of March Madness. And the same thing during the college football games. You used to have Chevrolet player of the game. You don't have that stuff anymore where they talk about the majors, very seldom, if ever. And so what's happened is we have this acceptance that college football players in the Power Five conferences, they are just different. And we don't view them in the same way that we view Division II or Division III college athletics. And so that change has been made, and the consumer is very comfortable with that now. They don't even question it. And I think that the NCAA is now saying, okay, we've broken these conferences off. They are autonomous. That's really not the NCAA. The NCAA is all the other schools, all the other opportunities, the educational opportunities that are afforded from the men's basketball tournament. And they don't say that college football and the Power Five supports it, but in many people's mind, they view that money has to be flowing to the other sports. And they've done a very effective job of now bringing in the Olympic sport movement.
Yes.
The Olympics, and how are we going to support our Olympic program if we don't have Power Five college football? Because everybody knows track and field is highly subsidized on the Power Five level, but that's where a lot of our sprinters from around the world, track athletes and track and field athletes from around the world, gymnastics, swimming, the view has been put out there that if we don't have the support of Power Five football specifically, that our Olympic program is going to suffer and we will not be as successful in the Olympics.
Do you see that as a propaganda tool of the
Yes,
hegemon? Yes.
I think they know exactly, because the Olympics are extremely popular.
Mhm.
Very United States loves the Olympics, whether it's Winter Olympics, Summer Olympics, but we really like Summer Olympics and we really like track and field because we win.
Yeah, if you paid attention to the NCAA website, I go there frequently just to see how they're packaging the propaganda. But during that Olympic cycle, both for the Summer Olympics and then the Winter Olympics and then the Paralympics, even though the
Right.
NCAA doesn't sponsor Paralympic sports, you had an obvious focus on the Olympics as a justification for the transfer of wealth from football and men's basketball players to the non-revenue sports. And it's powerful because that brings in patriotic themes. Do you find it ironic that the NCAA uses patriotism as a way to really sell their business model when their compensation limits are un-American?
Well, it's part of the collegiate model. And part of the collegiate model is this transfer of wealth. And you're justifying it, specifically saying that the Olympics, we are supporting the Olympics, which is one of our charitable outlets for our wealth. And that the athletes who we love to cheer for are not amateurs necessarily, but they're still patriotic. It's still USA. It's still, so part of this collegiate model is supporting these athletes that we know couldn't do it without our help. And you tie in Tracktown, the University of Oregon has been front and center on its remake, and Nike has done a masterful job of stamping the track and field center of the universe is Eugene, Oregon. And so it's not surprising to me that it's a college campus that they've made front and center of this transfer of wealth.
But that's a really interesting use of the Olympics, to justify the business model. And, you talked about the Power Five being cordoned off, and they're still operating under the NCAA umbrella. And I think there's some good reasons for that. But so they have this special place where they can keep their football money. They don't share that with the NCAA.
Right.
Right. But they still are under the NCAA umbrella.
And the Power Five conferences recognize that that's useful to them. Many people couldn't tell you who the conference commissioners are, and that's by design. They don't want to be well known necessarily. They're doing their job. Their conference commissioners are very smart individuals, and the conference staffs are very well positioned to do what they need to do.
So have this use of the Olympics and the model for Olympic development in almost every other country in the world is for the government to support the Olympic development movement. Yet we have come up with this model where we're relying on revenue from two sports with athletes who can't even participate in the Olympics, who are underwriting them.
Right. Well, it's the Olympic movement in whatever sport it might be. So, for example, field hockey is an Olympic sport that is very well positioned in the United States because of the use of the collegiate model. Track and field, swimming, gymnastics, not as much. Gymnastics sort of has its own development, but in men's gymnastics, it's much more tied into the collegiate system than women's gymnastics is oftentimes. So it's an interesting use of whatever you can to justify your model. We'll justify it for educational opportunities. We'll justify it for this. We'll justify it for the Olympics. So you just figure out, justify it for any way, but making it less exploitative of the players generating the revenue. That's the one area that seems to be not as tread upon, so to speak.
Yeah, something you said earlier about how college fans, look at the CFP, look at the Power Five football product. And I was, asking myself, do you think that Americans have kind of internalized some of the hypocrisies and corruptions in college sports, and they see it, but they don't feel like that it interferes with their enjoyment of the product?
Well, part of what I think the way that the American consumer is now viewing Power Five college football is through a NIL lens, because you have this mistaken valuation metric that's been developed. It's not saying that the players who have a $3 million valuation or $2 million valuation, that they're actually getting paid $2 million. That's the valuation from any number of ways that you can calculate it. But if you ask the normal, just the everyday fan, are college athletes getting paid now? And by college athlete, we mean football players in the Power Five. Are they getting paid? I bet you're going to have a high percentage who say, yes, they are.
Yeah. And do you think that's a barrier for athletes' rights going forward to look at some other issues? I've described that as the nil wall. And now, and I think that the in-system beneficiaries have used that to make the case that, look, they have this nil thing now. They probably don't deserve all this, and we want to rein it in. But they have it. What more can they complain about?
Well, the New York Times article, magazine article said they're now moguls. So that's by proxy, all of Power Five football and men's basketball players must be getting rich. And so we need to not worry about them being exploited any longer because they have access to name, image, and likeness. And so that's used as the justification for not paying them a negotiated wage. Look, they're already making all this money. What are they complaining about?
Right. So let me transition into what's happened really since 2019 when the NCAA and the Power Five really started to conceptualize their campaign in Congress. And I think that they decided that they had all these external regulatory threats. You had, SB 206, the California Name, Image, and Likeness law. You had the Austin suit, which was meandering through quietly through the process. You had some activity in administrative agencies. Of course, in 2014, we had the Northwestern case with the NLRB that kind of fizzled out. And so you had all these external regulatory threats that were coming together. And the NCAA and Power Five decided that they wanted to deal with them in one fell swoop. And they went into Congress. And they were asking for 3 extraordinary federal protections and immunities. And they still are. They wanted, the preemption of state laws that relate to compensation, and those were much broader than just name, image, and likeness laws. They wanted absolute antitrust immunity so that they wouldn't have to comply with our nation's free competition laws. They wanted a provision that athletes can't be employees, would prevent them from unionizing. Basically, it was just a complete takedown of the athletes' rights movement. And through that, they used some of these same justifications, like displacement. We heard that with the nil market, this displacement theory that came out of Lead One, that there's a fixed sum of money in this nil market. If we take some and give it to profit athletes, then it's going to be disaster for athletics department budgets, and they're going to start cutting sports and all that stuff. And they were talking about that with these collectives as well. And underlying all of that was the many versus few theme. And I heard that from Charlie Baker and Linda Livingstone in the last few weeks. We had the State of the Association speech at the NCAA convention, and that was their theme. That was the theme when they rolled out Charlie Baker. Do you see that as a kind of a tactic that we can tie back to the collegiate model? Or are these the descendants of the collegiate model?
Yes, it's a basic utilitarian argument. It says the greatest good for the greatest number. And so if some people need to be sacrificed for the greater good, the many versus the few, if we have to exploit the labor of a few, so be it. Because the overall value of the collegiate model to the country and to all of the athletes who have no market value and the coaches who are disproportionately overpaid because their market value is less. Don't overlook the fact that coaches in quote unquote Olympic sports, their salaries have gone up precipitously as well. So you have a coach in field hockey or lacrosse or tennis or golf or whatever it is, that coach is much higher paid than they used to be. And the athletes are getting world-class facilities built all over these college campuses. All of that, what they're telling you is, that'll go away if we have to pay these athletes. If you look at that New York Times article, that imagery of Armando Bacot coming out of the Audi is no more stark representation of a black male who is, if he is compensated appropriately, that money is going someplace other than almost all the other college athletes. And if you look at the participation rate numbers in college athletics, it's a high percentage white and it's a high percentage middle and upper class. And that's not inherently wrong or bad, but it is a reality.
It's reality.
And so while I'm not saying the system is racist, I'm saying the system is racialized because disproportionately the athletes that stand to gain from market forces being put into play are Black. And then not all of them are poor. So we can't, paint this broad brushstrokes, but disproportionately they're African-American males, and they disproportionately do not come from upper class backgrounds, as do the athletes in the other sports. And that's a very uncomfortable discussion for most athletic directors, most college presidents, most coaches, or anybody else that is discussing college sport.
Yes, it's difficult for all Americans, I think. And in the shadow of that silence and the fear of speaking, the NCAA has been able to propagandize their interests in a way that ignores the interests of the few. And I just want to ask you.
And Walter Byers talked about this in one of his last speeches. He talked about the neo-colonial mentality in which the overseers and the masters control college sport. And so all those years ago, Byers talked about the system that he created, and he knew that it was a highly racialized model or a highly racialized system. And that's part of what the NCAA and college presidents and college football coaches, college athletic directors, they have to deal subtly with that. And so NIL is a way, in my opinion, that they allow these athletes to work a part-time job. And if they're not successful, it's not because they don't have the opportunity anymore. So they've changed the compensation model from one that's collectively bargained to a gig economy, where these players are now allowed to get a part-time job if they want. And if they don't, well, it's their own fault.
On that point about the difficulty of talking about race and this important distinction between the racialization of the narratives versus a racist enterprise. And I think that's so important to keep in mind, because there are some critiques of college sports that view it as a racist enterprise. And I just think that's not a discussion that goes anywhere. But I think you can talk about the racialized narratives and themes and have a chance of having a productive conversation. And it's just so doggone difficult. Taylor Branch, in that article in The Atlantic, The Shame of College Sports, one of the lines that got the most attention was he said that when you survey the scene of big time football and men's basketball, you get a whiff of the plantation. But then he pulled back on that and said, I'm not saying, you have to be careful about making slavery analogies, and maybe colonialism would be a better analogy. And, you have written on some analogs for the situation that the athletes are in. You talked about company towns, you've talked about migrant laborers. How do you see it now as you sit here in 2023? Is there an analog that can capture all these themes we're talking about that doesn't turn people off?
Well, I think there's more appetite today for discussions about labor and organizing labor and unionization than there used to be just a few years ago. With the unionization activities with Amazon and Starbucks, and Google, and other gig economy organizations, I think there's more appetite for seeing that what the NCAA is trying to do is to develop its own company union within college sport, and it has for a number of years through the Student Athlete Advisory Committee, which in many ways has all the features of company unions, which was a tactic historically in the labor movement in the United States, where companies would try to have their own unions. And I think that's still where they're trying to go with college athletes. College athletes have so little power, and there's so much patriarchy and paternalism at play, which is why we've taken a look at how often college athletes are referred to as children or as kids in discussions of them. When college recruits are talked about, disproportionately they're referred to as kids or these kids doing this and that. We have a whole montage of an article that we're going to be showing at the CSRI conference coming up in March, where it just goes from time after time after time when college athletes are viewed as children. And the reason why that's important is children are very often given an allowance, and their parents and the patriarchal system controls their method of compensation. So I think that that's the pushback that college sport is using. They're using patriarchy and paternalism as a way to move the discussion away from these players being viewed as adults. And so I think, to get around to answering your question, I think it's going to be very difficult for players to organize. But I think there's a possibility, depending on how the National Labor Relations Board views these charges, I think that may give enough impetus to give some cover for college athletes in football and men's basketball, specifically in the Power Five, for them to be able to form associations and unionize. I don't think it's appropriate for Division III players to be unionized. Right. I don't think it's appropriate for Division II athletes and athletes in all of the Olympic sports to be unionized, because they're just different. And I think what has to take place is for there to be a reckoning that not all college athletes are student athletes in the concept, the way that buyers wanted them to be viewed, that some of them are, strictly speaking, employees, and some of them should be seen as consumers, quite frankly, of the collegiate model.
You know, you mentioned the power imbalance and how these athletes still, until they get collective bargaining rights, but of course, the precondition to enforceable collective bargaining rights is that you're recognized as an employee. And the student athlete is the NCAA said that's the opposite of employee. You can't be both at the same time.
Well, which is why the NCAA and its lobbyists want to get that preemption of college athletes being forbidden to be viewed as employees.
That's right.
And that's really an important point right there.
And there has been very little discussion of the three things I refer to them as the death provisions for athletes. That's the one that's gotten the least attention, and it hasn't come up in the congressional hearings. And the NCAA and the Power Five have been very coy about talking about it, because I think that's a tricky issue for them, because what's wrong with being an employee, And I think that highlights the collision between what they want and American values, real American values. Let me ask you this. So you had this hegemon model where the NCAA had this unchallengeable authority for, I don't know, it was founded in 1906. It didn't have an enforcement jurisdiction until the 1950s. But really, for almost 70 years, you had this hegemonic authority at the regulatory level. Now you have these external regulators competing for that hegemony. And with DYK, we have talked about this in terms of the Iron Throne. Who's going to sit on the Iron Throne of college sports regulation? And with the NCAA at a point of historic weakness, and then you have the Power Five kind of coming into NCAA governance. And they've actually been doing that going back decades, kind of a rolling hostile takeover of the NCAA governance. What does hegemony look like in 2023, and who should be sitting in the Iron Throne?
Wow, that's an interesting question.
I mean, do you think the Power Five can act as the collective hegemon?
I think they already are. And I don't know if it's any individual specifically that sits on the throne. It's whoever is in those roles as Power Five conference commissioners. And in many ways, it's the Power Two, with Commissioner Warren leaving for the NFL. I think Greg Sankey is the person that's best positioned to take on that role right now. He's a very smart individual. He's very good at what he does. And in many ways, I think he actually believes in what the NCAA and the Power Five in general. I think he buys into the fact that these Olympic sports and all of these other opportunities flow from the money. Otherwise, if you don't believe in the good that comes from supporting these athletes in all of these other sports, then it's simply just about money. Right. And I think the members of the Power Five conferences, they believe very strongly in the value of water polo and the value of because many times these people in conference commissioner offices and conference staffs, they were athletes, but they were most often athletes in the Olympic sports. And they may have had a really good experience in college sport. So their view of college sport is through the lens of their experiences.
Right. Well, I've been kind of critical of Sankey recently here in my other podcast, The Big Amateurs and Monologues, because when he steps out of his conference commissioner role and then into his NCAA governance role, he starts to sound more and more like Mark Emmert. And one of the things that we've done, transparency is a big piece of what we're trying to do with DYK, and really try to get athletes engaged and try to get them motivated to understand some of these issues better. But we did a chart that shows all of the key committees and governing boards and how many people there are. And you can really boil down the key decision makers at the voluntary regulation of college sports through the NCAA to about 5, 6, 7 people. And Greg Sankey is now one of the most powerful inside decision makers at the NCAA. And there are some interesting tensions in the various hats that he wears. And, we're going to talk about that because a lot of people in the NCAA has propagandized this. Mark Emmert's done it. Myles Brand's done it in congressional testimony, that the NCAA is like our American government, and we have a representative system. We have checks and balances. You have all the features that ensure decision-making that is based in integrity. That's not true at all. I guess I kind of want to wrap this up, Professor Southall, with if you were, well, let me just back up. Do you think that most college presidents, most athletics directors, boards of trustees, regents, faculty members, do you think they have read Myles Brand's Collegiate Model and his 2006 State of the Association speech, or your article with Professor Starowski?
Probably not.
Okay. Do you think they should?
Yes, they should, because if you support something and you think that something is good, then understand exactly what it is and understand what the ramifications are of your model. Because while I'm very critical of the collegiate model, I would be naive to say that it is totally evil. It's more evil than not, though.
Just to be clear.
Yeah.
I love that.
I'm wondering if they intuitively know this, but they made the decision to ignore data that doesn't conform with what they want to believe. This identity protective cognition
Yes,
we talked about before. We choose to ignore. Frank DeFord once said, we just ignore stuff that's ugly. And part of what we want out of our collegiate model is we want it to be a wonderful thing, because Duke playing North Carolina the other night was great theater.
Yeah.
And everybody loves it. And Tobacco Road rivalry and everybody, all of that stuff, for 95% of the people, that's a great thing. It's at what cost? It's similar to sweatshops on our products. So where are our shoes made? Where our produce comes from? All of the things. Who are the laborers? Who are the people that are creating this product for us? And I don't think college presidents want to go there.
Right. Well, Myles Brand, Walter Byers in his 1995 book, he was pretty hard on the university presidents.
Yeah.
And he basically, viewed them as kind of the fox in the hen house. And a lot of people feel that way about Brand's transition from kind of a firebrand critic of big time college sports in 2001. He gave that speech to the National Press Club, and he was saying that when he was president of IU, he just fired Bobby Knight. Before he became the NCAA president, he was saying we need less money in the system, not more money in the system.
Right.
And then 5 years later, he turns that upside down with the collegiate model. And on the identity protective cognition theory that, we avoid information that we don't really want to pay attention to, isn't an element of that we also are very quick and eager to grab onto information which supports our pre-existing beliefs? And that's kind of what I see with stakeholders at the institutional level.
Without a doubt, because, one of the justifications for big time college sport is if you win, then there's an increase in donor activity, there's an increase in enrollments or admissions, applications, all of those things, which may or may not be true, but you're exactly right. We like good news. As Mark Twain said many years ago, nobody minds a war as long as it's not too big and it's not in their own backyard. Same thing with college sport. We love college sport when it's positive and we're cheering and everybody's enjoying themselves and we're relating to each other and we're high-fiving the stranger in the stands next to us, but nobody wants to see how the sausage is made.
Right.
And I think we can justify the end product, that what we don't want to spend time dealing with is what are the inherent inequities and exploitative features of college sport, which are similar in many ways to many other elements of the capitalist economic system.
So I've taken way too much of your time. I love this discussion, though. I could go on for hours. I just love talking to you. But I wanted to get in a quick discussion of your new book. If you could talk a little bit about that, kind of where you see that fitting into your body of work and when it's going to come out.
Well, Dr. Strowski is a co-author. Dr. Nagel is co-author. Professor Karcher is a co-author, and Dr. Maxey is a co-author. So there's 5 of us that have come together. And some of us, wrote a little bit more than the others and stuff. But the discussion is, the title of the book is Exploiting College Profit Athletes, the NCAA and an Amateurism That Never Was. So it's our contention that college sport, at least since 1956, has not been amateur in any way, shape, or form. It's simply been the collegiate model. And part of the issue has been that college athletes have not been viewed as employees. College athletes have not been given their rights, which they have inherently. And so that the book really traces our research from the 5 of us for the last 20 years into the college sport and the collegiate model system. It goes back and looks at the racialized nature of it, deals with issues of Title IX, when Title IX should and should not apply to a college athlete in an employment setting. And so it's a long book. It's about 380 or 400 pages, but we think that it'll give an opportunity for people to look back at the history of college sport, big time college sport, and look forward on some issues on what quote unquote reform will look like. So it'll come out in 1st of May with University of South Carolina Press.
And a number of the co-authors you mentioned also joined you in a friend of the court brief in the Austin case.
Right.
Right. I was so happy to see that. There were some interesting friend of the court briefs in that case, and that was one of them. And who's your target audience? Do you think that this book is going to have appeal outside the academy?
Yes. We hope that it's actually for New York Times readers, to give them a chance to learn about what college sport really is, because you can't understand today's collegiate model until you understand the history of where college sport came from. But we also try to deal with social, cultural, political, legal, economic issues and how all of these come together in big time college sport. And at the center of it all is the exploitation of profit athletes, of the athletes in Power 5 football and men's basketball.
Well, this has been a great chat. And again, I just can't thank you enough for agreeing to be our launch pad for what we're doing. And we would love to have you back on again. It's very difficult when there's so many moving parts and so many issues in college sports. There are very few people, Professor Southall, who can speak at the 30,000 foot level like you can and have this discussion about, the values. And college sports is built around values.
I think there's places for a lot of different voices dealing with college sport. I am not a Twitter person because to try to talk about an issue, it takes me 10 minutes.
Right.
Number one, type with my thumbs if I'm using a smartphone. Anything that you talk about in college sport, there's probably 2 or 3 different iterations or views from that you need to take into consideration. So I enjoy looking at it from a large scale philosophical perspective. And so I appreciate the opportunity to have a long form discussion of these issues. And I'll be happy to come back anytime. I'll be honored
Perfect.
if you ask me again.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to having you back. Take care.